Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Sacred Symbols Plus. I'm your host today, Dustin, coming at you bit of a different time here. This is maybe the earliest episode recorded, which not that it's even that early. It's 8:30 for me, and I'm usually up at this time anyway, but the rest of us wouldn't be. But the reason for that is I have a very special guest today that I'm so excited to talk about. Genki, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here. How are you doing this evening for you? Because I understand it's 10:30 in Tokyo, right?
Yes, it's 10:30 at the moment in the evening. But yeah, thanks so much, Dustin, for having me on the show today. I'm really happy that I can be on today. I'm a really big fan of Sacred Symbols and what you guys have been doing. I think I've been watching since episode 1 or listening.
Whoa, nice.
Anyway. So I'm a fan of you guys, and thanks so much for having me on the show today.
Yeah, no problem. I was just saying to you right before we got started that I'm so excited to talk to you because Japanese gaming is so important. It always has been, but these last few months in particular, and maybe even these last few years, this in the West in particular, it's been this meteoric rise of Japanese games. And even in particular this year where we have just in the last few weeks, Persona 3 Reload, Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth, Grand Blue Fantasy. We've got Rebirth coming so soon.
Oh yeah, Rebirth.
This is the perfect time. And what I was saying to you is just that we only can have so much perspective on the Japanese market, and Sony is a Japanese company and how they operate. And I've always just been curious about that perspective from someone who's actually there. So this is so exciting. I have so many things to ask you. Before we do that, though, for the audience that maybe doesn't know who you are, tell us about yourself and what you do as far as, primarily your Twitter has just been, it seems like it's been blowing up. I see, I follow you, but I see I'm like, man, this tweet really took off for him. So tell us about yourself.
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks, Dustin. So I'm Genki, and I'm a gamer living in Japan. And I just enjoy video games. And recently I started in 2020. Or about 3 years ago, I started tweeting about video games because I just got a PlayStation 5, and I was really hyped about all the games that were coming, and I really wanted to share that online. So I started tweeting about it, and then since then I've been tweeting about video games from the Japanese perspective, and tweeting about the Japanese video game stores. And I also have a YouTube channel where I go around and do video tours of different video game stores in Japan. And also, I different events. Please, if you can, follow me on Twitter at Genki_JPN. And just check out my tweets. Lots of Final Fantasy tweets as well.
Yeah, which what's funny is I haven't been seeing you on my timeline as much because I muted all of the Final Fantasy Rebirth words. I'm not getting any Final Fantasy tweets right now. But the question I had for you was just that. So you are Japanese, obviously, but you're tweeting from a English account. You're tweeting in English mainly, primarily to a Japanese audience. Where was that idea that was okay, well, instead of tweeting for a Japanese audience, I'm going to focus on a different market?
Okay, so I was originally born in the UK. My mother is Japanese.
Okay.
So I grew up in the UK, mainly in London. And then I moved to Japan when I was 26. So I've been here for about eight or so years. So tweeting in English is quite natural for me because I grew up in England. And and I found there was a lot of there's not that much information coming out of Japan, especially in English, about the Japanese gaming scene. So I also saw that that was a space where I noticed people wanted information about what is actually happening in Japan in English. So yeah, I think once I started tweeting, like as time went on, then I like caught like popularity because like there's not that many people tweeting in English from Japan about
Mhm.
video games. So that's like a space that was there, and I think that's why kind of my Twitter kind of took off.
Yeah. I gotta say too, for the audience, you gotta check out Genki's YouTube channel because I think it's totally underrated. Some of the stuff you've covered, I was like, man, particularly the recent video I watched from you is the Dragon Quest pop-up store, which is so cool. I wish
Oh
that's
yeah, that
the
was
kind
cool.
of thing that they would do here, just because these pop-up stores are so cool. I was lucky enough when I was in Japan, I was going to the Evangelion store. I'm trying to remember where it was at. It was in one of the like department store places, but there was an Earthbound pop up that I didn't know was there.
Oh
I
wow.
was like, where else are you going to find an entire space dedicated to Earthbound other than in
Yeah,
Japan? So if you're curious about these types of things, Genki's channel is
yeah.
awesome to
Yeah, that's
check
one of the
out.
coolest things, like living in Japan. There's like so many different events going on, like so many cool different pop-up shops and gaming events or like exhibitions. So yeah, that's a really cool part of living in Japan and being into video games.
So I wanted to start by asking you, and this is mostly a selfish question that I've been curious about, is just that in terms of games coverage in Japan, obviously you hear a lot about Famitsu, right, and some
Yeah.
other publications like that. But what does it look like for the creator space? Like every once in a while, when there's previews, I'll see some. I think I saw like a Japanese preview of Helldivers. It was one of the earlier ones. But is the creator space really different there? I was even wondering, are there Japanese games podcasts? Like, is there a Sacred Symbols type show of Japan?
Yeah. Japanese gaming podcasts are not really a thing, I would say. Yeah, there are YouTubers, a lot of YouTubers that do gaming content, and like VTubers are really popular in Japan. But they don't have like the same kind of like influences as in the West. Like a lot of like advertising is very like influencer heavy in the West, but in
Mm.
Japan they focus more on like these VTubers or like these mini celebrities or talents to do their video game coverage. Yeah, and then like video game podcasts, like there are not that many like big ones in the West. There's so many like PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo ones, but in Japan there's not that many.
The VTuber thing has been really interesting to see take off, and even to some degree now here in the US, particularly Iron Mouse is probably the most well-known English VTuber. But you may have heard me, I mentioned on one show when I was in Japan going to the arcade in Shinjuku. I think it's like a newer arcade. And I went there to try an Evangelion VR experience. And when we were there, they had a whole event going on where all these guys were watching this VTuber. And it was, I guess, since I knew so much about Japanese culture going in, I didn't expect culture shock. But when I was there, I was like, I have never seen anything like this in my life.
That's funny.
Particularly the fandom around these VTubers is really interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, I think I saw that video you tweeted it out, and yeah, it looks super crazy. Like, yeah, you got the people like the salaryman or like the super fans like all dancing in unison and like cheering in unison, and yeah, it's super crazy, that kind of scene in Japan. And yeah, it's like a different world from like what you see in the West.
So obviously there are, I guess, that's kind of a more extreme example of some fandom. But I am curious about in Japan, how games are viewed by everyone overall. Just because another thing that surprised me when I was there, I was eating at a restaurant and we saw, there were some salarymen having a good time. One of the only times I saw any Japanese people kind of getting loud was at this restaurant when they were having a good time. But I noticed this guy who he had button up shirt and a side bag, an older guy, and he had a Spy Family like keychain, and it was so out of place. I was like, that's kind of cool. This and this older guy, he doesn't look like a Spy Family fan, but he's got this keychain and he's into it. So how do you feel like video games are viewed by people in general? Is it here in the US, it's become so mainstream that everyone's wearing gaming shirts and stuff like that. And obviously super mainstream in Japan too. But at the same time, it's a reserved culture in the same way where people aren't necessarily going all out wearing gaming gear all the time. So do you feel like there's a difference there?
Yeah, I think gaming in the West is way more like accepted mainstream than Japan. I think in Japan, if you take like a mainstream view, it's still very like niche, especially like when you come to like console gaming. And then of course there's the Switch, which is a super mainstream, but that's more seen as like more like a family or like a more casual thing. But in terms of like the hardcore gaming, like your PlayStation games, like those kind of HD, high quality AAA kind of games, that is very niche at the moment in Japan, especially in the mainstream. Because like in America, like people are just normally play like Call of Duty and games like that. But in Japan, it's not as like those AAA games aren't as mainstream, and it's seen as more like a niche thing. And maybe some people look at it like, oh, he's on like otaku, like a otaku kind of image, like a nerdy kind of image. So that still remains in Japan and it's quite strong. So it's like, it's a bit harder to express your fandom for games in Japan. Like you don't see many people wearing gaming t-shirts or gaming clothes as compared to like anime, for example, or as compared to the US, you wouldn't see people wearing like Zelda t-shirts that often. Maybe you'll see some Splatoon t-shirts or something like that. Final Fantasy 14 is quite popular as well. But apart from that, it's quite rare to see.
Which it's funny to me because when I was there, there was so much great gaming merch everywhere. I wore this shirt specifically. This is the Elden Ring shirt I got at the it was like a torch pop up. It's in the same building as the Nintendo store.
Okay,
Shibuya. In Shibuya. Okay. So,
yeah,
there's so many great options for stuff like that. So, I wonder, is there a feeling of, because you hear about, spending tons of money on figures and stuff like that, that some of this like fandom, even if it's not outwardly expressed, it's kind of hidden more where it's like, okay, maybe I'm not going out and I don't have a Zelda t-shirt on, but I have all the games and I have these figures and stuff like that. It's like a weird flip in a way.
Yeah. There are a lot of hardcore players, but yeah, they're not as like out in the open. And like hardcore gamers, they're more like reserved or like they do it in their house. And yeah, not as open as in the West, for sure.
So you brought up PlayStation, and obviously this is a PlayStation podcast at its heart. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about them and how they're perceived in Japan currently, just because there's been a big shift for them. So I guess we'll start general. Yes. How do you feel about PlayStation right now?
Yeah, I'm a big PlayStation fan because I grew up playing like a lot of PlayStation games, especially the PS2 era, and going on into like PS3, PS4, PS5 now. And in terms of PlayStation overall, they're doing quite well. But in terms of PlayStation in Japan, that's where I think they've like kind of lost a lot of ground and they're kind of struggling, to be honest, is what I see. I like the kind of mainstream popularity has like diminished or like decreased a lot in the last like 3 or 4 years. So that's how I see it in Japan, especially since from like, I guess it started, since the beginning of the PlayStation 4, like the decline started, but I think it's just continued until now, where it's like, the Switch is just dominates, like Nintendo just totally dominates the Japan gaming landscape. And like PlayStation is like kind of, it's doing okay, but it's nothing to like write home about. Especially on the software sales, they've like really dropped in Japan. I think the hardware is still doing quite well in comparison to PS4, but in terms of the software, it's like really, really low at the moment.
So, what do you think the reason for that is? Obviously, I think there's a few different ones, but I always wonder, is the shift away from first party kind of having almost no presence in Japan outside of a few, examples? I think of, the former Studio Japan devs that are making Astrobot. But Studio Japan is all basically shut down now at this point.
Yeah.
So do you think it's the content, or is it the hardware, being that it's so obviously the Switch is still a huge success in the US. Don't get me wrong. It's huge, but the main thing you hear amongst more hardcore people is they're like, well, this is a handheld. It's not as powerful, where in Japan, it's like the handheld that's seems to be the major selling point over the PlayStation. It's like, it doesn't matter about the power. So what do you think as far as like what has caused the decline?
Oh, what's caused the decline? Yeah, I think there's multiple reasons why there's been such a big decline. One of the main things is like the Japanese lifestyle. Japanese lifestyle has moved more to mobile in terms of people are just mainly gaming on their mobile phones, doing like apps and stuff like that. But it's also a thing about the tastes and preferences. I think PlayStation moved more to that like cinematic, super graphics experience. And that's not something particularly that the normal average Japanese gamer is looking for. I think they're more like their traditional kind of turn-based kind of games are like the most popular, or like, the anime style games, or like games like Monster Hunter, or, those kind of games that are really popular in Japan. And I think PlayStation moved away from that. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, the way I see it. Like, was it like the Japanese people who lost interest in PlayStation, or was it PlayStation that, kind of moved away towards the Western market away from Japan? So it's kind of those two things together that caused the massive decline. And I would also say like COVID didn't help at all as well, because during COVID, like the supply of the PlayStation 5 to Japan was like so low, like because they were prioritizing like the Western markets for like obvious reasons. You get more money per user out of the Western users, I would say. Because there's like more games that appeal to the West on the PS5. And also like during that time, there was like no PS4s either. So everyone was like stuck at home, and like people wanted like a PS4 or a PS5, but there was nothing there in the shops. There was like, they couldn't buy one. So I think that kind of caused people to move more to like PC, and like PC has kind of grown quite a lot in the last, it's like doubled or more in the last 2 or 3 years in Japan. So I think, yeah, it's like a combination of reasons why the PlayStation has like decreased in popularity.
Yeah, I remember hearing about the like insane lines and the lottery system to get PS5. So
yeah, that was crazy time.
For our audience here, tell us about that lottery system, because that's something that I don't think I've ever heard of happening over here, but is super common in Japan for more than just PlayStation, but like concert tickets and other hot items, I guess, to get. Yeah.
Yeah, they have this like lottery system, and I think Japanese people kind of view it as like a more fairer system. It's not like first come, first serve. They don't really do that so much. That does happen, but they were more preferred to do like the lottery system. That's like everyone enters the lottery, you fill in a form like your name and address, and then you get picked out like who are the ones who are gonna get the item or be able to buy the item. Or get the concert tickets, or get the like super rare item. So yeah, they do that system a lot in Japan, and I think it's just like, the Japan is like they're trying to make like a nice orderly society, so they don't want just everyone just rushing like mad to do things. So they'll like set up this lottery system so that it's more like organized, and yeah, everyone has a chance to enter. But yeah, the thing is, like, yeah, it's always hard to win those lotteries. And they were doing those for the PS5 for like 2 years. So it was like almost impossible to get a PS5 in Japan.
Wow.
For
yeah,
2
that's
years.
2 years. I remember there was a big thing. Was it the director of Final Fantasy 16 that there was a lot of Japanese gamers that were concerned because they're like, we want to be able to play Final Fantasy 16 at launch, but we can't get one. And so that was a big thing to make sure. So was demand, or was there enough stock by Final Fantasy 16? Like, so you said 2 years, so that would have been around 2022 or early last year. So like, can you go in now and get a PS5 in Japan?
Oh yeah, right now you can go in and pick one up. Yeah, they improved the stock since maybe end of last year. It got back to normal. But yeah, before then it was like super tough to get one. And yeah, as you said, like Yoshi P, the director of Final Fantasy 16, yeah, he also was talking about that. Like he was talking with Jim Ryan about the stock situation to try and line up the launch of Final Fantasy 16 with a good supply of PS5 to Japan to help the market. Because I think before 16, yeah, the supply situation was really bad in Japan.
Was there an issue of like scalping or people just trying to get one and then flip it? Because that was the thing here for years was just people buying them and then flipping them. So that happens there too.
Totally, yeah. I think the scalping problem was much more like enhanced in Japan. It was like crazy. And I think it's still a problem now. Because actually, if you look at the sales between PS4 and PS5, like the PlayStation 5 has actually like selling faster than the PlayStation 4. But that is because a lot of the PlayStation 5s are getting scalped and like resold to countries outside Japan, like to like China or to the other Southeast Asian countries. And that's because the yen is like super weak right now. So like Japan is actually the cheapest place in the world to buy a PS5, or one of the cheapest places in the world. So there was a big scalping problem as well, which was that was also affecting the Japanese market because the PS5s that were being sold were getting sent to China and they weren't going to the Japanese users. So that was another big problem that was in Japan as well, with a really big scalping issue.
Yeah, the yen situation was crazy. I mean, it still is, to my understanding. It's still like I've told people just because I knew that when I went there that I was like, oh, this is a good situation coming over with USD, to the point where when I came home, I did like totals of how much I spent. And I was like, wow, I should have spent more money in Japan. I didn't spend as much as I thought because the conversion is, not so hot. Maybe, I don't know if this is too like economic of a question, but do you think that the weak yen has had like a material effect on Japan's gaming, outside of just like, the PS5 being the cheapest available in Japan, but also like on game development, or if games in here US, people complain here about the $70 price tag. So is it becoming more difficult for Japanese gamers to buy games if they're working on a set salary?
Yeah, it's become very hard for normal people to afford a PlayStation 5 because like around the world there's been massive inflation, and then the yen is just getting weaker and weaker. So like they had to increase the price. I think twice they increased the price of the PS5 in Japan. And like now it's just like it's not really affordable for like a normal person. It's like because people's wages in Japan haven't increased, but the prices have increased. So at the beginning, the PS5 was like equivalent of like $500 in terms of spending power to a Japanese person, and then that's gone up to like around $650. Like in terms of Japanese people's spending power, but Japanese people's salaries haven't gone up. So like they're paying like, kind of feels like I know it's not $600 in if you exchange it, but it feels like that to a Japanese person because their salary hasn't improved compared to the like inflation around the world. So yeah, it feels like you're paying a lot more for PS5 than you would like a couple at the beginning of since it came out.
So in terms of, people getting access to games, what is the popularity of a service like PlayStation Plus? Are people interested in that kind of more streaming like, or not necessarily game streaming, but this Netflix like approach where it's like, hey, you can have the set price, you get access to all these games? Or is it still very much, we want to play Elden Ring the day it comes out? Or is it just, I feel like here it's kind of somewhere in the middle. So is there a big appeal for services like that due to the prices?
I think they're getting more popular, but it's hard to gauge like how much. I don't think they're as popular as in the West. There's like subscription services like Game Pass or PS Plus. So it's kind of hard to gauge. But I think the overall Japan is still a very physical heavy market. So they still prefer like having the boxes of the games and going out and buying the physical copies. I think that's still the main preference for Japanese people. Like there's still like people still buy CDs in Japan, like music CDs. Yeah, they have massive CD shops everywhere, and people rent DVDs still. Like they rent films. You can still rent films in stores. So Japan has a still very strong reliance on physical media. And its subscription services, I think they're doing okay, and they do advertise them a lot, but it's hard to gauge how popular they are.
Well, I'm glad you brought up, physical versus digital. That's one of the notes I wrote down here. So it was a perfect cue up, just because that's one of the other things that is so different in the US as far as, people here now. I think we just read a stat on Sacred Symbols just that we recorded yesterday. If I remember correctly, on Sony's financials, like 1 in 3 games was physical for the PlayStation 5. So we're seeing a huge shift, but going to Japan, it's for a Westerner, it's like stepping back when you see games not only in like a used store, but even in actual video game store. It's like, man, there are shelves and shelves of new games here. So seeing that difference, do you feel like, and this applies to both PlayStation and Nintendo, it's kind of like this weird tension where they want to go digital because they make more money on it, but they have to consider their home market too, where physical is just still so big. What do you think that is the reason, like why Japanese gamers are still attached to, very much like me, having the box or these different things, like as far as your collection?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I know, Dustin, you're a big physical guy, and like you're always fighting with Colin and Chris about physical versus digital. But yeah, I think in Japan is definitely there's this physical reliance, or like this. Yeah, physical is definitely much stronger than digital at the moment, and I think it's just the culture is like maybe it's a bit slower to adapt to change as compared to the West. They'll do it if they have to, but it's a lot slower. Especially you can see. I think people just have like a more like reverence for physical media, and like maybe like handcrafted things as well in the culture. So maybe they'll value more physical goods as compared to like the US, and also like they're like. The used market is really quite strong as well in Japan, and people take really good care of their games, so like they're easy to resell, and there's like a big used market. So shops like Book Off where you can buy used games.
That's my favorite store in Japan.
Oh yeah, that's an awesome place to go for like old like used games or retro games, and you can get them for quite cheap. So yeah, they still have this culture of like valuing physical media. It's still quite strong.
Would you say that this is something I bring up a lot of why people are still holding on to physical games? You mentioned about games being feeling more expensive, or for a Japanese person, their buying power more expensive than ever. That it sounds like it's a natural part of how to even play games. It's like, well, I can just get it so much cheaper, in the games that I buy, I can then take to Book Off or some other, or, a store or something, and then be able to get new stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that also plays a part in terms of people can resell it. Like you can sell it on Mercari, which is like a really popular, it's like eBay. Like Japan don't have eBay, but that's like the eBay, like Mercari or Yahoo auction. You can sell it on there quite easily. So yeah, I think that's also part of it, like the economics of keeping value in your purchases. Yeah, I think that's another part as well, because people often trade their games to Book Off or sell them. Yeah, so that's another part.
While we're on the topic of used games, I wanted to ask you about retro games in Japan too. And you mentioned
that's a good one.
the great condition is one of the most awesome parts of when I went over there, just to see. You mentioned Book Off, the used store. It's kind of for people in the U.S. It's like a really nice Goodwill or thrift store, but has everything. Where there's clothes, and some of them obviously they have a lot of books. One of the ones I went to in Kyoto, I think, was the Super Book Off, and there was
you went to a super. Oh yeah, those are crazy. Those are crazy.
They had like entire rows of used figures, and they had like card sections and toys. It was amazing.
Games. Yeah,
but
that's crazy.
The condition was amazing, because when you think of retro games here in the US, it's like, man, you're going to spend a lot of money, hundreds of dollars on certain games, and it may or may not be in that great of condition. Whereas in Japan, I was looking at, boxed copies of Chrono Trigger that looked amazing, that were, I'm trying to remember how much Chrono Trigger was. And it was shockingly like low.
3,000 or 4,000 yen.
Yeah. Dude, like I got a copy of the first Suikoden game on PlayStation 1 for, I think it was 80 yen, which the condition was a little more, it was good condition for the US, but probably terrible condition for Japan. But so in terms of retro games, are people still buying and playing on their old hardware, or are they just buying to collect? Because that was one of the things I wondered when I saw people going in and checking out these games. I'm like, do they have their old hardware set up, or is this purely a collector's standpoint?
I think mainly it's probably collectors. There are some like really hardcore collectors that still play on the old hardware. But I think mainly it's like collectors things. But like the retro scene is not so big in Japan as compared to like the US. And so that's why you see so many games for so cheap. Maybe the only expensive ones would be like the Pokemon games. They get quite expensive, the retro ones. But all the other games, like you can pick them up for super cheap. So it's really good place for like retro games coming to Japan. And you can get loads of games for like dirt cheap.
I've heard even to the point now that post-COVID, once they reopened for tourism, that, I mean, obviously the tourism boom in Japan is insane to the point where they're trying to figure out how to handle things. But have you heard about some of these stores just cranking up the prices? Because they're like, man, these foreigners are coming here and buying all this stuff, and we're selling it for dirt cheap. We should take advantage of this.
Yeah, that was happened. Yeah, it was actually on the news, in the national news in Japan. Like as soon as the borders reopened, there was like an influx of tourists, and like one of the main places they first headed to was like Super Potato, or like these shops where you can buy used games in Japan. And there was like reports on the news about how much these shops were selling. So yeah, they in areas like Akihabara, they cranked up the prices for the tourists. So if you do come to Japan and you want retro games, I would recommend like going to like more like rural areas or a bit outside Tokyo, on the outskirts of Tokyo, to buy the games, because in all the main hubs they've like really cranked up the prices because of all the tourism and the popularity of the retro games.
Have you been? This is mainly just a question for me, but have you been to Nakano Broadway?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a cool place. Yeah, I really like it.
That place,
they sell like old anime cells, and they sell lots of games and mangas and like art books. Yeah, it's really cool.
That's the main place when people ask me where to go and they're in Tokyo, like they're visiting Tokyo, they're like, should I go to Akihabara? I'm like, nah, you should go there, but don't go there first, because you're gonna go broke pretty fast. Whereas, like you said, going to the more rural areas, that's the one thing that on our trip we were in Tokyo, Kyoto, and then just a tiny bit in Osaka, which was awesome. That's kind of the golden path of tourism in Japan. So next time I go, I want to go more, to the smaller places or up north or something like that, just because there's lots of other cool stuff there. But
for sure.
I wanted to ask you also about Xbox in Japan, just because they've been trying there for a really, really long time. And so what do you feel like the Xbox presence is like? Has it increased? Has it gone down? How do Japanese gamers feel about Xbox?
Okay, thanks for this question. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. Because
please, I'm so curious about this.
Yeah, I'm actually in the UK when the original Xbox came out. I was at the launch event, so I've been a fan of Xbox since the original one. But yeah, I didn't get Xbox One, and I only recently bought a Series S. But in Japan, Xbox has been had a tough time overall. I think in terms of the history of Xbox in Japan, they went really big at the beginning, right? They had lots of marketing, they got lots of exclusives. The Xbox 360 era, we had games like we had Dead or Alive, and we had Lost Odyssey, Blue Dragon. Right. We had all these exclusives, and they were building momentum. I think they sold 1.6 million Xbox consoles in the 360 era, and that was the height of it. But the problem was after that, they completely bailed out of Japan. They stopped doing exclusives with Japanese studios. They just completely bailed out of Japan and supporting Japanese studios. So Xbox One was a really bad era for Japan, for Xbox in Japan, and they kind of lost their their brand recognition kind of went down. And if you ask people nowadays what is Xbox, most people don't actually know what Xbox is, although it take a while to think, oh, I remember Xbox when they had Star Ocean on the 360. That's not really natsukashi. That's it. Oh, that's really nostalgic, or something like that. If you just talk to a random person on the street. So yeah, they've had to kind of rebuild their image, and they've been doing that over the last couple of years. At the beginning of the era, they were kind of struggling, and yeah, one weird thing was Xbox were Microsoft was saying, oh, Japan's one of the fastest growing regions in the world at the beginning of the generation, but they were kind of comparing their growth to the Xbox One, which did so terribly in Japan. I think it sold only 100,000 units in Japan. So yeah, that was the issue. Many people in the West were getting confused. Oh, Xbox seems to be doing really well because Microsoft was saying those kind of statements, and that wasn't particularly true. But they have been improving in the last few years, and I think they've sold 400 or nearly 500,000 units, which is not as good as Xbox 360 era, but they are starting to build up again, and it's still not a mainstream. They don't do any mainstream advertising. That's one issue. You don't see any ads for Xbox on TV or anywhere in public. Maybe in the game stores you'll see a little bit, but yeah, as you said, what was you came to Japan, and then you saw the situation, and were you surprised with the Xbox presence, or what did you think of what you saw?
It was interesting in that I expected it to be low, but it was lower than I thought. In that some game stores that I would go into barely had an Xbox section at all. And I'm not even talking about just used places, but somewhere like Big Camera, right? That it's okay, they've got this tiny little sliver for Xbox. But when you're there and you see the comparison of like the Nintendo section,
the Nintendo section is just massive. It's like so big, right?
yeah, exactly. And so, and now in particular, we were talking about physical games, and here in the US, Xbox, for all we know, it's still kind of rumors and just what we can see on store shelves is that Xbox is kind of done doing physical games, which with that being the primary way for Japanese market to buy games, that's almost feels like, I mean, obviously they need to make decisions for the good of all of Xbox and not just like, oh, we got to make sure we sell here, but it's kind of outside of Game Pass, a white flag in Japan, where there's not going to be a lot of opportunities to even really sell those games unless someone's willing to go digital. But do you think, we talked a bit about PlayStation Plus, but as far as it being a core business tenant, I mean, Game Pass kind of is Xbox now. And I do remember seeing a few different Game Pass related like store signage, like that was kind of the main push. And so do you feel like Game Pass is more appealing or kind of in the same spot as PlayStation Plus where it's not really even, it's a factor, but not necessarily something like it is here where because the games only are more Western focused, it's like, whatever.
Yeah, I think it's similar to the PS Plus situation in Japan. I think, there's Xbox have been pushing more digital in Japan, like even more than the US. Because like in the US, you can still buy physical Xbox games, but in Japan, like they no longer make physical Xbox games, like hardly at all. Maybe they'll do one for like Forza or Halo, but apart from that, you won't get any physical like third-party Xbox games in Japan. So yeah, they're really pushing Game Pass in Japan, and I think it's a bit too premature because like Japan is more of a physical market. So I would prefer them to kind of cater to Japan, like also try to push physical as well. But Microsoft as a whole company, they're going towards digital, so they're kind of just sticking with that in Japan and doing that kind of more like early than in other regions. But yeah, it's kind of hard to take off. But I think they're more like focused on working with the Japanese publishers, and they're not as focused on the market, it seems, because they don't do any advertising or like they do like fan event, like they could do visit TGS and do some fan meet and greets and stuff like that. But I think they seem to be more focused on publishers and getting games to sell to the West, or like Japanese games. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we saw this most recently with Persona 3 Reload being on Game Pass, which initially would make you think that might take a hit for sales on a Persona game, or even, they released all the older Persona games, but it didn't. I mean, it was still the fastest selling Persona game ever in general. So it makes a lot of sense that they might not be that interested, or not, I don't want to say not interested, but focused on selling to the Japanese market, but they're sure glad to go and get some of those games to bring them for their Western audience.
Yeah,
so,
that's what they're focused on for sure. And yeah, at last year's TGS, I went to like the Xbox, like there's like a fan meet and greet, and I attended that. And I got to talk to Phil Spencer.
Cool.
He said, like, I asked him, like, are you planning to get more studios, or are you just going to try to like expand with like working with third parties? And then he said, they want to expand like their own studio, like Tango Gameworks and their own Xbox studios, but he also wants to do more than that. So they probably want to like get some more studios or do some more things in Japan. So they are trying to do more stuff in Japan, but it just takes more time because they need to build up their popularity and stuff like that. But they are working on it behind the scenes, but it just takes time and it's a bit slow.
Right. Well, and I'm curious what you know about is in terms of like Xbox is very much focused on acquisition and acquiring studios. And you mentioned Tango, which I believe is their only Japanese
Yeah, the only one.
team. Do you know about it being more difficult for them to just acquire studios in Japan? Because we've talked about this before on Sacred about like there's a very, I'm trying to think how to put this, nationalistic viewpoint in Japan about being against being purchased by foreign companies to kind of remain truly Japanese. Do you feel like that's probably one of their hurdles?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's possible, but it just takes a lot more. Like, there's a lot more like holes to jump through, or like there's a lot more things to do. If like it's a lot tougher for like a foreign company to buy, especially one of the bigger Japanese companies, because there are like laws and like protections against those kind of acquisitions. So you'd have to go through a lot of like red tape, or a lot of processes to be able to do that. I mean, it is possible, but it's just like, yeah, even like acquisitions don't really happen that much in Japan as well. Like, it's a very different gaming landscape to the West, because in the West it's just been acquisition crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
For like the last 2 or 3 years. But in Japan, like you only see small studios or like private studios getting bought up, or you don't really see big like publishers or massive studios being bought. That's not something you see in Japan. So that's like a completely different cultural thing like that's happening. So that's why like the Japanese games industry really differs from the West. There's not really this crazy acquisition things going on, and I don't think it'd be very hard for like Microsoft or a big company to buy like a big publisher like a Bandai Namco or a Sega or something like that. It would be quite difficult, or Square Enix. It's possible, but it would just take a lot of work.
Right. Well, that's kind of one of the interesting aspects is you, at least from here, we hear about how hard it is to immigrate to Japan, and a cultural aspect that just so different from here is this idea of like protecting the national identity, right? Like not bringing in, like, obviously they love having foreigners come in as tourists and spending money and helping the economy in Japan, but keeping that Japanese identity to some degree. And it's interesting to see how that permeates from something as big as immigration, but also from a business standpoint, it's like we want to keep our Japanese teams owned and operated here in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, I think in the public perception, they want to keep things very Japanese, and that's like more political thing. But yeah, it also applies to like the laws and stuff. So there's a lot of protections against big foreign companies buying the big staple Japanese companies. It's a lot harder to do. Yeah, for sure.
Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? Because I think that there could be arguments for both where, diversifying and having a company outside of Japan really help flourish things outside of the country, I think could be positive. But at the same time, it's this like, well, we like Japanese games because they're Japanese. There's something totally different than what we make over here. So what do you think about that? Is these protections a good thing, or are they hampering the growth of the industry?
Personally, I think they're good because like we don't want like just like China coming in, or like Tencent coming in and buying like Bandai Namco and everything. Or that's so like there's protections against that kind of stuff. So that's something I appreciate. And yeah, it also keeps these Japanese companies like Japanese, and like they have that uniqueness that is very Japanese, like the style and like the ideology of like the thinking towards making games. So I appreciate that. Not everything's becoming like the same like everywhere in the world.
Sure.
We still have this like unique market in Japan. So I kind of appreciate that there are those protections, so that like, for example, if Microsoft came in and bought like all the Japanese companies and they'll become like westernized, I prefer that not to happen. So I appreciate the the protections. And but yeah, hopefully like the Japanese companies can adapt themselves to become more like successful around the world. But it does seem like they are trying to do that with like the simultaneous releases around the world and like translating the games to release them at the same time. So yeah, I think I prefer that approach.
You mentioned it being kind of a more political question. Is that kind of like a push and pull, or like a hot thing in Japan where it's like we need to remain the same, or it's like no, our economy's hurt and we need to do something?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the impression I've always gotten, is that I don't know, is it kind of a touchy subject that I've broached on without realizing?
No, not really. No, I think it's just normal politics in every country. But yeah, I think the main thing in Japan is like the population decline is quite a big problem, and they need immigration to solve that, or to help solve it. But they're quite reluctant to like just take in like loads of immigrants. So that is an issue in Japan at the moment, where like the birth rate is super low, but
Right.
then there's not really a good way to fix it, because like the work culture is like doesn't help people have kids or make families because they're working so hard, and they don't want to take in too many immigrants. So yeah, that is a political issue in Japan at the moment.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've been curious about, is that I'm sure that there is a thing for people that immigrate to Japan. There's like a shock of like, oh man, this is so much more than I expected in terms of work. And I could see that there's like, well, foreigners aren't used to how we do things here, and that's going to slow us down in terms of like how much gets done and stuff. But there is the argument too about like this idea of like the Japanese work culture is not healthy either.
Yeah.
So,
oh my gosh, yeah. Especially in the games industry is like one of the worst in Japan. Like it has such a bad reputation in Japan. Like in Japan, there's this thing called like white companies or black companies, and like the white companies are like the good ones. Like they do everything by the law and are good, and then the black companies are like the ones that are bad, and like they make people do overwork, like unpaid overwork, or they have lots of issues like power harassment and these kind of things. And like in Japan, like the gaming industry is kind of one of the like worst place for like it has a really bad reputation. It's got improved in the last like 5 years or so, a lot. But before that, it was really bad, like a lot of overwork and unpaid overtime and like health issues. And yeah, I've heard some really bad horror stories about like working in the gaming industry in Japan. It's like some really terrible like power harassment from the bosses, and some really like even people like they're like some people like committed suicide at some of these studios due to like the power harassment they receive.
wow.
So, and like the pay is like really low. If you notice, like in the last 2 years, a lot of the Japanese companies have upped their pay by like 10 or 20%. And that's because like their base pay was so low to start with. So it's quite easy to like raise it up. But also they're doing that to compete with like China and other countries. But the base pay is like has a reputation for being very low. But it is improving, and there are some good companies. I think the big ones are okay, like the big publishers like Bandai Namco and stuff. But maybe the smaller companies are still quite what do you call it, black. They would do like overtime and low pay and like harsh working conditions. So it still has a bad reputation, but it's getting better. So that's a good point.
And it's really interesting just because the crunch aspect has something that has really been highlighted here, but primarily focused on Western companies from Western reporters. So
yeah,
you said that some of these things are improving, but is there it sounds like more, I don't know if secretive is the right word, but it's just kind of like, this is how it is. If you want to be here, then that's just how it goes.
Yeah. It's kind of like swept under the rug, or like, it's like open secret everyone knows, but like they don't really talk about it, you know. And like there's like things like unions are not really a thing in Japan at all, like
Hmm.
just in the general culture. So it's really hard to change those things. They are changing, but it's just really slow. And yeah, as you said, like there's no like Jason Schreier kind of investigative journalism going on. Yeah, I think they
Yeah.
have this kind of like black book kind of system. Like they, you know, people they don't like. There's this like the public harmony. People don't want to disrupt it. You know, they don't want to sue the company or anything like that. So like things don't really come to light as much as they would in the West, where there's like people reporting or people like suing or complaining. That's not really a thing that happens as much in Japan, unfortunately, but it's just part of the culture, I think. People don't like, they're not really sharing like or reporting the bad things that happen. They're just kind of swept under the rug many times, unfortunately. Yeah, but yeah, hopefully things get better though.
Yeah. Well, and it's what's curious to me, and we talked about this from a Western perspective, is just that even with some of these conditions, people are still desperate to work in this industry. Do you think there's a thing as far as a Japanese developer wanting to work for some of these companies that I guess I just wonder if, if it's they're just kind of an assumption of like, well, this is how it goes. Hopefully I work for, you mentioned a white company instead of a black
Mm-hmm.
company.
Yeah.
And well, maybe this is just what I can get right now. So I'm going to work here and work like crazy in hopes that things get better. And then eventually either hopefully do or don't, and then burn out or
Mm-hmm.
something even worse happens, like you mentioned. So,
Mm.
um,
I think I think people are trying to get to those big companies like the bigger ones like Bandai Namco or Nintendo. Oh, Nintendo is like super white. They have really good working conditions and really good pay and lifetime employment, those kind of things. So like Nintendo has like probably the best or one of the best working conditions in the games industry in Japan. Yeah. I guess just a cultural issue is the overwork or like people just doing like crunch and stuff, but that's more like a cultural issue as well. So it's kind of hard to solve. But in terms of the pay and stuff, they're hoping to get to the bigger companies like Sega or Square Enix or Nintendo and get better working conditions.
you bring up Nintendo, and that's a great segue to talk about them a little bit and just their total dominance right now in Japan. We were talking about on Punching Up. I'm trying to remember the exact stat, but like something that in the past 10 years, the top 10 selling games have always been Nintendo games in Japan. And it's crazy from seeing it there on the ground floor. It's like there's Nintendo stuff everywhere, obviously Nintendo theme park. And we kind of have that to some degree here in the West too, where it's like Nintendo has just become this insanely huge company that dominates in all sectors that it's operating in as far as video games. And now there's the Mario movie and there's more movie plans and stuff like that. So how do you feel, or what do you think as far as the shift in Japan? Wii U was terrible here and did insane damage for the Nintendo brand. And then just this crazy turnaround with the Switch. Was that kind of the case in Japan too? Or was it kind of just a little more of a lull?
I think the Wii U didn't sell that well either in Japan. I think it was a worldwide thing. But yeah, okay. Of course the Wii did really well, super well everywhere. But yeah, I don't think the Wii U did that well particularly. I think it was more like even with PlayStation at that time. But the thing with the 3DS was crazy. The 3DS did like super well in Japan, unlike the DS. But then like moving to now with the Switch, it's just gone like to another level. There's a complete dominance. Like everyone has a Switch. Like the Switch is actually the best selling console ever now. according to Nintendo in Japan. So that's crazy. And the dominance is crazy. And I think it's because Nintendo really focus on Japan, on the Japanese market, and creating games that fit like the Japanese lifestyle. They have the portability which suits Japanese lifestyle, and the games as well. They have like the Animal Crossings, which Pokemons, which do super well in Japan, and it's just like become a mainstream thing. So Japan, Nintendo are still very Japanese, and Japan is like their main focus. It's not like Sony, which is like more like they moved their headquarters to the US, so they're not focused on Japan that much. So that just left a big hole for Nintendo to just sweep up everything, and they're just doing super well now.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about them being such a Japanese focused company is that I wonder with Sony if they're kind of regretting to some degree their change, because you see Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is going to be one of the biggest games of the year. And, we mentioned those other games, Persona and Yakuza in particular, Japanese games here. And it goes beyond games too. Like anime in the West has just continually shot up.
It's getting more and more popular every year.
Yeah. And so I wonder if there's this idea like, man, maybe we shouldn't have shifted away as much and kind of stayed the course, more like Nintendo.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think there was a bit of lack of like foresight, or like to see it looking into the future, because in the last like few years the Japanese things, or Japanese anime, manga, games culture around the world has just like exploded. And I think Sony as a Japanese company, games company, or PlayStation as a Japanese games company, they haven't really taken advantage of that at all. Of course they have like Crunchyroll, they've taken advantage of like the whole anime boom and stuff like that, but in terms of the games, I don't think they've really taken advantage of that kind of the explosion we've seen in Japanese culture around the world. So that's a shame. They didn't have that foresight to like kind of see, Japanese things are popular now, and they're not really doing that much in Japan, because they only have 2 studios in Japan, and like I find it kind of ridiculous. I'm from the UK, and they have more studios in the UK in Japan. It's just ridiculous now. And even like Team Asobi, like they're Japanese, but they're not. I really love Team Asobi. Like Astrobot is amazing, but like the leader of Team Asobi is like French guy. He's a really cool guy and everything, but he's a French guy, and their goal is to make more like global games. So like they've completely removed their focus on making like Japanese centric games. Sony have, so that's completely different to Nintendo, which is still like still quite focused on Japan, and like they're still very Japanese company. Like can you imagine Nintendo moving their headquarters to like Nintendo of America, becoming the main part of Nintendo? Like you can never imagine that. But yeah, because Sony, like they moved to the US, and they kind of focused on Japan, so that's a big issue. And I think it's really affected their popularity in Japan as well. Like people were angry on the PS5 when they switched the X and the O button over. Like people were like, what's going on? And even recently, like the direct creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, he was like, what the hell were they doing? Why the hell did they do that? I think the PlayStation completely like moved their focus from Japan, and that's affected their popularity. And then Nintendo just came in, and there's like total domination at the moment. So that's a shame.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has been really interesting these last few weeks, and I guess in the last year to some degree too, is that seeing how the popularity of the Switch and its handheld nature start to really affect change for, you could say it's just handhelds, but it really applies to games in general, because the Switch, the hybrid nature of it being so appealing. And then now we see devices like Steam Deck that also have this, it's not a hybrid per se, but this idea of like, you have a game on your PC, you can also play it, and it has cloud saves, and it's on the go. And now we hear about rumors of an Xbox handheld that does the same thing. And we're also having rumors about PlayStation working on potentially a new handheld. And so I'm curious what you think about that, as far as, I guess it was viewed for a while. You mentioned mobile gaming being so popular in Japan, and the kind of move away from that. But now it's like, it's kind of like the Japanese game thing, where it's like, they were onto something, and now we've got to react to that, and figure out how to gain that market share back.
Yeah. I think, that is something that Nintendo were really good at, like having that foresight to think, oh, let's make a mobile and a home device. And I think that's what Sony would need to have any chance of like gaining some ground back in Japan. They would need like a handheld device probably, or like a both, the one you could do like handheld and docked device. I think that's the only way they could gain back some of that market share. Otherwise, it's quite tough, because Japanese lifestyle has so moved towards that kind of flexibility of having like a mobile or a docked device. So I think I think that's the way forward in Japan, especially.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. So when people play like a mobile game, like when people play Switch, I guess I expected to see so many people playing Switch on the different trains and stuff.
But you probably didn't see.
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
So if one of the things I've always wondered is, if handheld gaming is so popular in Japan, where are they playing where are they is it just in their house? It's just like a convenience thing, or what's up with that?
Okay. I think the main thing is Japanese lifestyles. Average Japanese person's house is very, very small and cramped and confined. Like, not everyone has like it's not like the US where everyone has like 60-inch like massive TV. Usually people are gaming in confined spaces. They're probably like playing in their bed, or like sitting on their couch, or like just like something like that in the house. It's probably the most common way to play. But with kids, you see, if you go to Japanese parks, you see kids in the parks, and they're all gathered around with their Switches. So that's like a common place where you'll see the Switch, like outside. Yeah, as you said, it's quite rare to see people gaming on the train. Maybe like when Animal Crossing was there, you would see people with Switches on the train. But since Animal Crossing kind of went down, or like since time has gone on, you don't really see people gaming with the Switch on the train. In the PSP and the DS era, you'd see them everywhere. But mobile phones kind of took over since that. And like gaming on the train is mainly done on mobile phones at the moment. I think that's what they need to do, is focus on mobile or like portable device. People don't have that space in there. Like, most people don't have big couches and big TVs to sit down and play like the console games. So that's why the Switch is doing really well.
Yeah, the mobile phone thing, that's the thing on the train that we just see all the time. And it was either a mix of people reading manga, or playing a ton of games that I would try not to snoop and look at someone's phone. I didn't want to be rude, but I was always just kind of curious, like what kind of games people were playing. And a lot of times, like, man, I have no idea what that game even is at all. But a lot of people are playing it, and even to the degree too, when we were in Shibuya, it's like, man, there is a giant ad for a Monster Hunter mobile game here, which I think that came out here too. Their Pokemon Go game that just I'm super, super huge to do that. I want to close out asking some questions about popular Japanese games in Japan versus the US. So what would you say, and I think I know the answer to this, is the most popular, I don't want to say the most popular IP in general, but like, I don't know. I think from the West, we'd be like, oh yeah, Final Fantasy is the biggest, but that's not the case, right?
Oh yeah, not in Japan. Yeah, Final Fantasy has kind of become more niche, especially in recent years. Um, yeah, so the biggest game franchise, um, I don't. I think it's probably there's a few. I think Monster Hunter has become really popular, especially like yeah since the 3DS and I mean since the PSP really. And but yeah, in terms of like RPGs, I'd say Dragon Quest is definitely the most popular in Japan. And yeah, I think
Hmm.
Dragon Quest is like almost like twice as popular as Final Fantasy in Japan. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really like the most popular RPG game, apart from like Monster Hunter. But in terms of like turn-based or like your traditional RPG, it's like yeah, people love Dragon Quest. You see slimes everywhere in Japan, and like Dragon Quest merch everywhere.
It was eye-opening when I was watching your video about the Dragon Quest pop-up store and the Dragon Quest Monsters game,
Mm.
and how it was like, seemed like it was really big over there. And when I went, because I remember thinking, I've heard of this game, I saw it in a Nintendo Direct. And then when I went, there was maybe 5 or 6 English reviews, all by much smaller YouTubers. Whereas I think you said in the video, it was like sold really well day one in Japan,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, it did really well in Japan. I think it sold like over a million units
Wow.
altogether in Japan alone. And yeah, it was like they didn't print enough. They didn't expect it to sell so well. So like it was out of stock for like the first few weeks. It was like really hard to find a physical copy. So like the digital sales also were really high as well for that game. But yeah, that was like that was a game that was really popular in Japan. Yeah, there was no like Pokemon this year, I guess. So that one like had a good space to fill in, and it did super well in Japan.
It's interesting to think about. You mentioned Final Fantasy becoming more niche in Japan.
Mm.
Is there this idea like, oh, this is a Japanese game that isn't really aimed towards Japan anymore? Because I think about Final Fantasy 16, and if you mentioned turn-based being the primary play
Yeah,
style,
that's
the
like the
preferred play
bread.
style. And so
Yeah.
is there a feeling like, man, we have Japanese developers that are kind of making Japanese games, but also not really, because they're kind of shifting towards a different audience in terms of taste?
Yeah, that's for sure. I think yeah, as I always say, like turn-based is like the bread and butter of like Japanese gaming. That's
Mm.
like the impression I get when I just see things around. So yeah, when the games move towards action and stuff like that, it does seem like it's more aiming at a more like worldwide audience, or try to get more new fans onto the series. And yeah, that's what I felt with Final Fantasy 16. Yeah, I really love that game. And yeah, personally, I prefer like action over turn
Mm.
based, but I still love turn based games as well. But yeah, I really enjoyed 16. But I guess in Japan, like people prefer the turn based. And yeah, I think Final Fantasy 16 is still the best selling PS5 game in Japan. But like the issue is like it only sold like 400,000 physical units. But previous Final Fantasies, they would sell like a million or 700,000. So it has been quite a decline for like the series in Japan. I think yeah, there's probably it goes in line with like there's like a correlation between the Final Fantasy series and like the PlayStation popularity in Japan, like both like declining. We can see like a clear like correlation there, as well as like yeah, the Final Fantasy games aiming more towards a worldwide audience in terms of becoming more action oriented, and that yeah, that has affected the like mainstream popularity. It's no longer like the Final Fantasy 7 days in Japan where Final Fantasy was like massive. Yeah, I think Final Fantasy 14 is still really big in Japan. That one like is played by a lot of Japanese people, but in terms of the single player games, they're not as popular as they were before. Yeah.
Yeah, it's surprising in some way. Do you think it's accurate to say, I guess from your perspective, when I went to Japan, I guess I expected certain series that are really, really big here to be just as big in Japan, or bigger, obviously. But something like Persona which is huge over here. I mean, not in terms of like a Nintendo where it's like everywhere you can buy merch everywhere, stuff like that. But so, Persona here is, after Persona 5 became real big mainstream success. And then so when I went over, I was like, man, I'm so excited. There's going to be so much Persona stuff. And I was surprised. I was like, man, Persona might be, it feels kind of more niche in Japan in a way than it does in the US. Do you feel like that's the case for that? And is there other series that you think are kind of surprisingly more popular in the US than in Japan?
It's a good question. In terms of Persona, I think, they are quite popular, but as you said, it's probably not as mainstream as the US, because with Persona 5 it's just exploded. The whole series has exploded worldwide, and I think it's like kind of more mainstream now in the US, and probably then it does mean that it's become more popular than in Japan, because of that. Because there's like so many more people in the US, so and so many more like hardcore, or like so many more like mainstream gamers in the US, I would say.
Sure.
And also tied to like PlayStation as well. The series is kind of tied to PlayStation in Japan as well. I think it has become more popular in the West. And then other series that are like that, more popular in the West, it's hard to think. But there's a lot of Nintendo ones like Metroid and stuff that are just not popular in Japan at all. And and then like Metroid's like super popular in the West. And there's a few other games that are like that. Even like the fighting games recently, they don't sell that well in Japan, like Street Fighter or Tekken. But they've been selling really well in the West recently. I think we've seen a decline in the fighting genre in Japan in terms of the sales. But they're doing really well in the West, which is making up for everything. And then on the flip side, I would say like a series like Pikmin is like doing super crazy in Japan, and then not as crazy in the West. I think most of the Pikmin sales have been from Japan. Then the other PlayStation ones, it's hard to think. I think recently, I think only Ghost of Tsushima, like from Sony first party, did really well in Japan, as well as in the West. But other than that, like Sony first party games, they don't sell that great, or they're not that like popular in like the mainstream audience in Japan.
Yeah, I've always wondered a game like The Last of Us in Japan. Obviously, it's a huge title, but I always wondered, like, are people into a game like this that's more hyper realistic, hyper violent, very character and story driven, and obviously Japan has a lot of that too. But I would imagine, like you said, there's like just not as much of a taste for something like that.
Yeah. The taste is very different from the West. I think a lot of American games, they like the like aggression, or like the aggro, like the big, aggressive, like strong protagonists. But in Japan, that's not really popular. So games like God of War are not that popular. Last of Us is okay, but not really that mainstream. And like these Sony first party cinematic games, Ghost of Tsushima did really well. That's because it was like really accurately depicted Japan, and people really were drawn to that. But in terms of the other Sony first party games, they're not that popular in Japan. People don't emphasize like graphics or cinematics. They're more like interested in characters, story, like colorful characters. They're not so interested in this kind of hyper, like this realism angle. They're more like the anime style characters are more popular. Yeah.
So 3 lightning round. I don't know, we don't have to go fast, but I guess more broad questions for you. As a participant and commentator in this industry, what do you think the West can learn from Japan in terms of gaming? Either, and you can take this anyone, as far as development or from the players. What do you think we can take away?
That's a good question. I think there's a lot of like both sides have their good and bad points. But I think in terms of Japanese development at the moment. I think a good takeaway could be like the production budgets and like the whole yeah, because I think in the West it's getting way too crazy with
Yeah.
like games costing. I know like you have like games like Final Fantasy 16 that probably cost hundreds of millions as well. But I guess there's other games like Sega's games and like Tekken and stuff like that. They're a lot less. They cost a lot less, and like selling 1 million is good enough for them to like keep making them. But yeah, I think so. Like having like less expectations with the like high quality like cinematics or like super over budgeted games. I think that's something that the West could look at Japan for. Like you don't have to have like $100 million games or like $200 million games. You can make like 50, 60 smaller like a Dragon or like Persona, like those kind of games, more of those kind of games that sell well and are not super expensive. So I think that's something the West could take from Japan.
So then on the flip side, the opposite question is, what do you think Japan could or should learn from the Western aspect of things?
That's a good one as well. What could they take? I think maybe like one thing I like about the West is how like accepted gaming is in like mainstream. Like there's still this like otaku, oh, I look down on gamers in Japan kind of attitude in the public, which is not as prevalent in the West. So I would like that to be like I would like to see more people wearing their gaming t-shirts outside and that being more accepted and not like looked down upon as much as it is in this general society in Japan. So yeah, just like gaming being more accepted mainstream in the mainstream. That's what I'd like to see in Japan. That is good in the West or better in the West. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I say this is the last question, and it is the most important question of all, Genki. Are you a One Piece fan?
That's a good question. I am.
Careful how you answer here. You might not be invited back if you say no.
Okay. I am a okay. I'm not a hardcore fan. I'm not like super into the series.
Yeah.
I just like a far away like observer. Like a fan, like a fan in that sense. But I'm not like super into the series, or like I've only seen like the first few episodes of the anime. And yeah, because like, oh my gosh, One Piece is like the most popular manga in Japan. Yeah, it's like it's much more popular than everything else, and it's just been going on for so long. And yeah, the movies do super well in Japan, and it's Japan loves One Piece. It's probably the most popular manga, as I said. And yeah, I'm just like a outside viewer, and I appreciate it. And I've had some experiences with the series and the anime. So yeah, I appreciate One Piece a lot, but I'm not like super into like following it and stuff like that. But yeah.
I think
I know you're a big. I can see your One Piece flag.
Oh yeah, my
so I know you're
my straw hat flag.
Oh, and yeah. I've heard about your One Piece card game. Like your activities and stuff like that. You're collecting.
Oh man, it's so bad right now. I think I'm giving it up because the stock in the U.S. is so bad. It's so ridden by scalpers where, like packs, like a pack normally would be $4 or $5 in what it should be at a store, but people will go to the store and immediately buy every pack and then sell them online for $10, $15 each, like 3 times the price sometimes, which
they need the lottery system there.
or at least try to print some more of these cards. I think it's just they weren't expecting how popular.
Yeah, One Piece has really blown up in the US, which I'm really happy about. It's like really glad seeing that. Yeah.
Are there any anime that you are really into? If One Piece isn't it, then what's your go-to?
Yeah, I like there's few like I like that Attack on Titan. I was watching that for a while, and the what have I been seeing recently? I mainly watch the films, anime
Okay.
films. Like I'm into Ghibli a lot, like the Ghibli films and stuff in terms of anime and series. I haven't been catching up that recently
Mm.
with like the different series, but yeah, there are a lot. Yeah, I watched the Pokemon anime, the new one, stuff like that.
Nice. Have you been to the Studio Ghibli Museum?
Yes, I've been there. There was a
I'm
time I
so
was going
jealous.
like once a month when I was first in Japan. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really cool. It's a really nice place. Yeah, you should definitely go if you haven't been next time. And you have to book in advance. So like that's the difficult part of getting the tickets. You have to book like
Hmm.
1 month in advance. So that's a difficult part of. But it's a really nice place. It's like really chilled environment. They have like the big not Nausicaa, Laputa
Yep.
robot at the top, and they have like Totoro, and yeah, loads of different cool things there. So yeah, I recommend going to the Ghibli Museum.
Yeah. Next time I'm in Japan, I'm definitely going to go to that. And you and I will have to get together because, man,
Oh yeah, for
I,
sure, that'd
I,
be awesome.
I want to go back so bad immediately. I mean, I know people, you
Yeah, yeah.
know this from listening to the show that I am made fun of regularly for being the
Oh
typical Western white guy that is obsessed with
the
Japanese stuff.
and
But
the sacred symbols weeb.
that's right. Yeah, the
Believe.
sacred
But
symbols
yeah,
weeb.
but the
But
weebs are rising at the moment, so this is like it's a good time. It's a good
that's
time.
right. Dude, we're playing Persona right now. We've got Rebirth coming so soon. I can't wait.
Oh yeah,
I know,
Rebirth.
dude,
I'm so
we didn't
excited
even
for that.
touch on Rebirth at all. And we're already an hour and 25 into this. So there's so many things, but Rebirth coming so soon. I know you might be the most hyped person that I see online about this
Oh yeah,
game.
I'm
Your
super hyped.
excitement is through the roof.
Yeah, yeah, I'm super hyped for that game. Actually, like the tweeting about Final Fantasy remake was like kind of what started my like online presence. So yeah,
Yeah.
I was super hyped, and like yeah, remake was like my favorite game of like last gen. So yeah, I'm super. I've just been waiting for Rebirth for a long time, and yeah, I'm super hyped for that like crazy. So that's the game. Yeah, I think that's going to be my favorite game of this gen. Yeah, I'm also excited for Stellar Blade, which also looks
Mhm.
really cool from Sony. They're publishing it anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, those two games. But yeah, especially Rebirth because it's going to have so much content and it's just going to be like reliving those moments from like the original Final Fantasy VII again. And yeah, the emotions and yeah, and the twists and yeah, the surprises. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to Rebirth like crazy. So yeah, that's going to be a good one for
Yeah.
sure.
We are I mean all this is one of those games that almost universally everyone at Last Stand and now we have
Mm.
Brad too, which
Oh
he's like
yeah, yeah.
the
I'm looking forward to you and Brad, and Gene as well,
oh yeah.
getting together to talk about that. Yeah, I'll definitely gonna check that out when you guys do
Yeah.
that. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
say
we're
hi to
all
Gene as well because he follows me on Twitter. So
oh yeah.
we
Yeah,
had some.
absolutely. I feel like I haven't talked to him recently. He's been kind of, he's at Dice right now. We'll be
Mm,
recording Punching Up together this week, so we'll be able to talk
nice.
then. But yeah, absolutely. And yeah, dude. So thank you so much for doing this. This has been super fun and really eye opening in a lot of ways. Of just like I said, we can only read so much, but being able to talk to someone who understands this and has a totally different perspective has been awesome. So for our audience, I know you mentioned it earlier, but where can people find you? What do you want to shout out in terms of what you do?
Oh yeah, thanks so much for having me again, Dustin. Yeah, you can find me on mainly on Twitter, which I'm tweeting all the time, mainly about Japanese games or like Final Fantasy or some other games. You can find me on Twitter at Genki, GENKI_JPN. I also have a YouTube, which is at Genki Gamer. And I said, like, yeah, as Dustin said, I just take videos around Japan. Like, yeah, I did a video of like the Monster Hunter pop-up store in Japan as well. And I also have a Patreon, which you can support at patreon.com and /Genki Gamer. So yeah, anyway, you could support or yeah, just subscribe to the YouTube or just follow me on Twitter, and that'll be much appreciated. So yeah, thanks so much for having me today. It was really fun talking to you, Brad, a fellow lover of things Japanese. And yeah, I hope the weebs keep on rising and things from Japan keep getting popular. And yeah, that's what I love to see.
Yeah, this has been awesome. The weebs, we're not only going to rise, we're going to take over this year. We've got the high ground right now, particularly. Yeah. So yeah, thank you again. Thank you to everyone listening to this. We appreciate you. If you're listening to this on Sacred Symbols Plus, you're on our Patreon already at Last Stand. So we appreciate your support so much. Make sure to go follow Genki. Check out his YouTube channel and his Patreon. There's a lot of good stuff there. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, for listening. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand's shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.